Oh, I can advance the slides.
Yes. You'll just have to go, like, hover your cursor.
I did it. So I'm going to be talking about some very specific things to consider when you're setting up a narrative. So rather than talking about maybe how you do a museum display or how someone might give a tour, I'm going to back it up in terms of, how do you set up the narrative for success and any historic site, whether it's you're doing a wayside, tours, setting up a traditional house museum. I hopefully through this conversation, I want to get you thinking beyond a traditional house museum tour or setting it up like a traditional house museum. Those are expensive, and we'll talk about some of the challenges with that, or kind of what has been the standard for interpretation at historic sites. But really all this is it's analyzing your physical and your narrative resources. So what is the story this site has to tell? What kind of artifacts, if we have artifacts, what is the building's time period? All of this. Asking yourself, really, what's the story? What is the most significant thing about this place? And who is the audience for this? And it could be the community. It could be a national audience. It could be a niche audience. And those things should really drive the narrative that you're telling at your site. So I want to start with determining the time period, because this may seem obvious, but it's actually a bigger deal than you would think and can really drive a lot of your interpretive narrative. So of course, a lot of the historical significance, it's on your National Register nomination, or for the National Park Service, it's in their enabling legislation. But here's an example of a site where its time period of significance, why it is a National Park Service site, which is roughly the 1580s, isn't really conducive to a historic site interpretation. And I'm curious, has anyone been to Fort Raleigh National Historic Site in Roanoke, not Virginia, but in North Carolina? Okay, so a few of you have been there. Excellent, excellent. When you got there, you may have noticed there's not a whole lot to see. You can understand it's the lost colony. Do you see the irony here? It's the lost colony. There's not a lot to see. And the Park Service did not choose to do a reconstruction. The Park Service sometimes does reconstructions of buildings, but it's rare. And in this site, they didn't. So like many fort sites, the interpretation of the lost colony focuses on archaeology, and they have a visitor center, a building where they show maps and graphics, and through narratives and the archaeological evidence they found, they do their best to tell the story of the lost colony, but it's the lost colony. So, they don't have a lot of information on the lost colony. So what they've done at the site is they brought the history up to the 20th century. And one of the most significant things about this site is actually this theater performance that was developed in, I think, 1937 at this outdoor theater space that interprets, it's a dramatic performance of the lost colony. So to me, this is a really good example of a site that it's difficult to interpret because of the physical evidence there, but it almost is an example of interpreting itself, okay? So they're interpreting this play as part of the story of this site, which is an interpretation of the lost colony, okay? So this is an example where it is wise and smart to expand the interpretation well beyond why it was initially set up as a National Park Service site, okay? So this kind of interpretive narrative of expanding the significance and not just focusing on one event doesn't work well for many places. It works to Lost Colony, which is a fort site. It works really well with coastal forts. And these are places like, maybe some of you have been to Fort Sumter, you've been to Fort Macon, Fort McHenry. And these are coastal forts funded by the federal government after the War of 1812. Because after the War of 1812, the federal government realized we really need to fortify our eastern coast, our seaboard. So they develop all these sites, these forts. Most of them have significance to the American Civil War. So they're not built for the American Civil War, but that's really what they're known for, especially places like Fort Sumter. So there's many of them that are preserved, and to me, they're fabulous, but many of them have a significance from the War of 1812 through even World War II, okay? And it actually makes sense for them to interpret this large span of history. Now, one of the ways they do this is they have these casemates, and basically a casemate is just a small room inside a fort. So they may have been used for sleeping, for dining, for storing powder kegs, whatever. But because there's so many of them, they use them as either kind of set up like a period room, like you see at Fort Augustine. They also sometimes are just used as gallery space. So it might be just graphics or photos or a museum exhibit kind of interpreting the long history of this space. Now I have this graphic on the side, and this is from St. Augustine, because when you're interpreting this long history, which remember doesn't work well for all sites, it's very confusing sometimes knowing where you are. So St. Augustine was occupied by Spain, Britain, Mexico, and the US at various time points of its history. So it can be very confusing going through a site like this, not knowing where you are and what time period. So very simple graphic. Basically, this little circle with the pie pulled out tells you what we're talking about, like who owns the space of what we're looking at the moment, okay? So if you do a long history at a site, you do need some of those cues so people know where they are in the time period in the story. And in a West Virginia example, there's the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It's an amazing site, amazing history. It also has a significant long history. It's going to be from the late 19th century to probably the late 20th century, or at least mid 20th century. And it would be you'd be hard pressed to pull out, any of those time periods to say this is the most significant, and we're going to situate this site in this one time period. So they do a great job of talking about this long history. However, because the tour is largely narrative, sometimes on the tour it's confusing if I'm in the 1980s, am I in the 1920s, in the 1940s? So sites that are doing this really long span of history need either some kind of visual cues or just some sort of attention to the fact that, when we're doing long history, people need to know exactly where they are in the narrative. Okay. Now, I'm going to say these are exceptions. Most sites doing the long history does a disservice to the site and historical significance. So many of you have probably been on house tours where you walk in the door and you just get a chronology of when the house was built, all the people who owned it, when it got taken over as a historic site, and then you're on your way, okay? That can be, that is probably a case where it's not good to do the long history. You really kind of want to pinpoint why this place exists and why it's historically significant. But these are things to think about. The time period really does matter when you're setting up a narrative or interpretation. Now, here's a site I love. It's a really interesting case study for many, many reasons. Has anyone been to Whitehaven, the home of Ulysses S. Grant and Julia Grant in St. Louis, Missouri? Okay, so this will be a new one to you. For those of you that are interested in this site, they did an online tour during COVID. That's a video. You're welcome to watch it online to kind of see how they're doing the interpretation. So there are many sites, historic sites, dedicated to the life of Ulysses S. Grant. So that's one complication. So that's a resource and a challenge. So there's one in Galena, I think there's one in New York. There's many, many sites where you could learn about the history of Ulysses S. Grant. This particular site is Julia Dent Grant's home where she grew up. So when they lived at the house, and it was not for very long, 1854 to 1859, it was crowded. It was Julia's parents were there, her siblings, their 4 children, and the father enslaved. It was a plantation, and he had a large enslaved population who lived there. Julia Dent Grant's father. So the Park Service wanted to interpret as how did this experience, actually living on a plantation where there were enslaved people, affect Ulysses S. Grant and kind of his views during the American Civil War. Okay. So it's a really unique time period in Grant's life. So let me ask you some questions. If you're setting up the interpretation, this was a Park Service site. I think it was established in the 1980s, but it really wasn't until the 1990s that they started going through the process of developing it into an interpreted historic site. So if you were in charge of this place, would you just focus on 1854 to 1859? Anyone? Yeah, Jean. I think you're on mute. I don't know if you were trying to say something. Or you just were voting, you would focus on that time period?
Yes, that was my vote for yes.
Okay, okay.
But I imagine this is a trick question.
It's a hard one. It's just kind of what they were thinking through when they developed the site. So not a trick question, but a challenge for the Park Service. Yeah, anyone else?
I don't think that I would just focus on those 5 years, because if they're interested in how the experience of being around enslaved individuals was for Ulysses S. Grant, you would need the context of how all of those people came to be in one place, I would think, to understand it.
Yeah, and that's, every site should be talking about the historical context. But for this site, if they really do want to focus on how this experience of being the enslaved population, being around, being on an actual plantation, you do need to expand the interpretation a little bit. So the other challenge is we're getting just, is it fair to give visitors who are coming to the site who, probably have heard of Ulysses S. Grant, just this one slice of his life? And I think that is something that's unique to a site that is of someone that's so important, and there were so many aspects of his life. Do you also need to kind of give people the story of what happened after he lived there from 1854 to 1859? So these are all the kind of things the Park Service are walking through. So as many Park Service sites have, they do have a visitor center, and that is not possible for all sites. But what the visitor center does is it gives them the opportunity to provide kind of this background information before he lived there and what happened to him or his historical significance after he lived there. But not all sites have that. But one of the most intriguing things about this site is they didn't have much furniture that had provenance to the site. So one of the big questions they had to ask themselves was, should we furnish this to look like it did between 1854 and 1859, which is a very traditional method of interpretation, or do we not furnish it? And if we don't furnish it, then what do we do? Okay, so they chose not to furnish it. And what I found is any site that I have gone to that does not have furnishings to say what it looked like when the person lived there, or do their best, what it looked like when the person lived there, is it forces them to talk more about the stories of the site and the people. Okay, so if you're at a site where you're facing, oh my gosh, there's no furniture in it, but I know most house museums do have furniture in them, I would suggest really thinking about, do you need the furniture? Sometimes furnishings can be they're almost like a stage set, especially if they don't have provenance to the house. So in that case, why go to that expense when if it's just a stage set to tell the stories, you can tell the stories of the site even without furnishings in there. So they have, sparse furnishings like a table here or anything that really has provenance or belong to the site, they have there. But it's a fabulous interpretation. I encourage you to look at it if you're interested in this method of not having furniture in the site, in the space. Okay, so they use the visitor center appropriately as providing that context to expand that time period, but the house itself focuses on 1854 to 1859. Okay, so I'm moving on to kind of talk about sites that they're unlike Ulysses S. Grant sites. Maybe no one knows who Juliette Gordon Low is. So I'll just ask, you don't have to answer, but does anyone know who Juliette Gordon Low is? She's very significant, but some of you do. Excellent, excellent. Okay. So for those of you that don't, she is the founder of the Girl Scouts. Okay. So for a very long time, and I got to tour this site in the 1990s, and it was your traditional site that really emphasized a niche audience. So people they assume that only people come here if they know who Juliette Gordon Low is, or maybe they're in the Girl Scouts. So a big audience, but it's really a niche audience. So what that did for the interpretation is it was a walkthrough kind of identifying things that Julia owned or things that Julia created. And everyone seemed just happy being amongst the greatness, seeing where Juliette Gordon Low grew up, where she lived, and all the things that she owned, or all these, just being in the house and experience the greatness. Well, if you didn't know who Juliette Gordon Low is, that kind of causes a problem. It's not going to have the same meaning for you. So a lot of sites deal with this problem. It's kind of, the people who are there, the niche audience will get something out of it. But how do you expand beyond that niche audience? Okay, so there's many things that could be done at the Juliette Gordon Low birthplace. It's very significant antebellum home. They survived a very serious malaria outbreak. There's lots of things you could talk about her childhood or her family. But what they did instead was to focus on interpreting the legacy of Juliette Gordon Low. And I think this works extremely well for places where they might not be nationally known, or you want to make them meaningful, is kind of ask yourself, what causes would this person be interested in at this time period? If they were alive today. So one of Juliette Low's causes was really literacy, literacy among girls, among children, and education. So in the house, there was a library that belonged to her father. And the traditional tour that I took was essentially, here's where her father had his books. You kind of glance at the spines and, okay, yeah, like library, great, great. What they did is they totally changed it and they called it the Reimagined Library. And it's now an interactive center. It still has some of the original books on display, but it's also interactive. It's where children go to read. There's activities, there's computers. So in the effort of carrying on Juliette Gordon Low's legacy of being very interested in literacy, they turned it into more of an interactive space to promote something that they think Juliette would have been very supportive of. Another site that does this is George C. Marshall House. It's called Dodona Manor in Leesburg, Virginia. This site is also a challenge because George C. Marshall, for those of you that don't know who he is, he was Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, but he got his claim to fame as a leader during World War II. I think he was the chief of the Army during World War II. Very beloved person, and he's the author of the Marshall Plan, okay? So this man is a very devoted public servant. He didn't really own a house until he retired. So it's this interesting time period. You interpret him as a retiree. It's almost nice because you can do a retrospective of his life. But George Marshall was, one of the most important 20th century leaders, public servants. So what the site does, it does programming with a local college to do leadership workshops, kind of based on the life of George C. Marshall. So again, kind of using his legacy to make it meaningful to a broader audience other than people who are just interested in George C. Marshall. So now I want to give an example of a site in West Virginia. It's an amazing site, very complex, very rich in its historical significance. There's a lot going on at Old Hemlock. So George Bird Evans, he was an author, he was a hunter, he was a dog breeder. There's an old hemlock grove there. The house is it says the oldest preserved residence in Preston County, West Virginia. So when I first met the director of his name's Lee Graffius, he kind of asked me, what should we do at this site? And honestly, I was at a loss because there's so much going on. Do you focus on George Bird Evans? Do you focus on the dogs? Do you focus on trying to set this house up like what it used to be like, in Preston County in 1782? So what we end up doing, there's another slight complication, is that George Bird Evans himself made it explicit in his will that there were to be 50, I think, 2-ish artifacts on display at all times in the house, but it wasn't to be a house museum. So that adds some other complication to the site. So really not knowing what at all to do with this site that has so many amazing historical narratives, we decided to host a charrette. And that's just kind of a fancy French term for bringing stakeholders to the table to try to figure out what is most significant about this place. So some of the stakeholders were board members, dog owners, people in the community. We had someone from the Park Service who came. And really to kind of hash this out, what is the best use for this place? Now, I will say that there was someone from the Park Service that could not wrap their brain around that there was not going to be an interpretive center, because that's a Park Service model that is a wonderful way to interpret a place where you can provide context, all that. There was not going to be an interpretive center. They just didn't have the resources for that. And, is it really accessible, like that people are going to come, stop on their way, park, like they would a National Park Service site? So can anyone guess what the big story, who was the audience, who's the best resources, who's really going to use and benefit from this place? Well, this one surprised me, but it's the dogs. Okay, it's the people who own these dogs that are these are English setters, that, they come, I think, about 1 or 2 times a year. They get the dogs together. This is really the niche audience who, if you're going to have to choose where to put your resources, this is the group that has the most meaning to this site. Now, understanding there's a lot more historical significance to this place. It's not going to be open for tours. Lee J did some wonderful things with the help of AmeriCorps. I saw Jamie Billman is on this, and I think she was AmeriCorps at Old Hemlock. They got on the National Register. They did a historical marker. They do programming. They have the house open 1, 2, 3, 4 times a year so people can come in and see it, but it's not, interpreted like a traditional house museum. And I think this is a really good example of how do you think about this place, who's it most meaningful, and how do we address that community's needs, but also make it accessible to anyone else who might be interested. And I'm going to end with a recommendation for a book called New Solutions for House Museums. So for the past 2 or 3 decades at conferences, there's a conversation asking the question, are there too many house museums? Rhetorical question, yes, there are. So this book, there are too many to be sustainable. So this book really kind of helps walk through the process of, if it's not going to be, can it be a house museum? Should it be a house museum? And if not, what are some other solutions? And to me, one of the best examples of kind of finding this alternative solution that interprets a place but is not a house museum is the C&O Canal National Historic Park. So this historic park was established during a time in the 1930s where people were just starting to think about national parks as historical parks. So for the most part, they had been established as recreational places, places that you wanted to preserve, beautiful landscapes, natural areas. But this one posed an interesting dilemma because it's both recreational and obviously historical, okay? So this is kind of the first that really tried to balance that. But even doing so, the recreation aspect of this park has always taken precedent. And about, I'm going to say 20 years ago, they started thinking about all these lock houses that are along the canal. So this is also a complication of a very long span. It goes from Georgetown in DC to Cumberland, and there's all these lock houses along the way. Now, if your primary focus of this park is recreation for bikers or people who are along the trail, the historic sites over time really got neglected. There are museums where you can get the historical interpretation, but what do you do with all these lock houses? So someone came up with a brilliant idea. Let's turn these into places where people can stay overnight while they're biking along the trail. So it's brilliant because it's run by the C&O Canal Trust. It brings in money to interpret and preserve these lock houses. And it provides this kind of immersive experience. So some of the lock houses, like the one in Georgetown, have electricity, most of the amenities that many modern people, myself included, enjoy. Some are very rustic, where it's just it may be running water in like a porta potty out back with no heat in them. So they're all different varying levels along this trail. But each of them is interpreted. So they've chosen a time period, and like the one in Georgetown is interpreted to the 1950s. So some of the furnishings that you sit on, beds you sleep on, are kind of the time period of the 1950s. But then they'll have images of lockhouse keepers on the walls, or they have 3-ring binders that just have photographic history of the C&O Canal. So they're interpreted, but they're also immersive, that you can stay there. And it works so well for the Park Service because they have a model in their recreational areas where there are cabins where people can stay. So they simply adapted this model to C&O Canal, and they added this extra level of interpretation. So I think I'll end with that, because to me, this is such a great example of some of the things that you can do to interpret a site without turning it into a house museum.